Alright, gonna do a video focused on beginners, just talking about the opening, and kind of the general themes people hear about the opening, the mottos that are repeated, and why I think they're useful and why I think they might not be in helping your play improve. So, we're often told that the goals of the opening are to control the center. We've got these four squares particularly, to develop our pieces, and when pieces are said, we tend to mean knights and bishops. Rooks and queens and kings tend to come later. Kings, obviously, you know. Third part, castles. Castle the king early. The king is generally less safe in the center than it will be castled. Based on teaching young players, this is not necessarily at all obvious to them. It gets more obvious when they see something like the 4-move checkmate. I'm making ridiculous moves for black. But once they see this, it can make more sense to them why they might want a castle and put the rook controlling that key square. And if we look at the opening position, and we count just how many times is each square defended. h2, defended once. g2, once. f2, once. e2, 4 times. Queen, king, bishop, knight. d2, 4 times. c2, once. b2, once. a2, once. So one might conclude these are our 6 weakest squares. But the worst defender of a square is the king, both because when they recapture, they might be drawn into the open and have to suffer an attack, but also because if the king is checked, they'll often be driven away immediately. The king is the weakest defender, and the king's a nice target to attack. So f2 and f7 relatively are the weakest positions in each camp, and castling is a nice way to mitigate that. Can also bring our rook into the game. So if our goals are control the center, develop our pieces, specifically meaning our minor pieces, knights and bishops, castle the king or get king safety, and I think a fourth one that's useful is mentioned by Artur Yusupov in his excellent series, his 9-book series, which is stop the opponent doing the same thing if you can, right? It's not just, ooh, what did I do? Sent us completely to the wrong page. It's not just accomplish these goals, it's if you can prevent the opponent from doing so, that's a huge boon to you. So I also you see a lot of beginners playing moves like h4. Now, h4 does not control the center in any way. It does not help us bring out our knights and bishops, but people will tell you it helps them bring out the rook. The problem is, if black plays a move like e6 or better e5, not only do they control the center of the board, and we'll get to a bit more of why the center matters, they also prepare to develop their bishop and their queen. That was bad arrow, and they prevent our rook coming out. The bishop can just take it. So this does not, in fact, help our rook get into the game. For the same reason, this move is silly, because the bishop controls the same square. We're often taught piece values early on, that a pawn is worth 1, a knight or a bishop are worth 3, a rook is worth 5, a queen is worth 9, some say 10, but let's go with 9, and a king is worth infinity. And thus, if black can so easily trade a bishop for a rook if we try to bring it out early, bringing out the rook early doesn't make sense. And this also tells us bringing out valuable things early when there are so many pieces and pawns still on the board is often going to be dangerous. We're often going to lose time retreating or not be able to bring them out because the risk of trading them is so high, which tells us why quite often the rooks and queen do not come out early. The queen does more often because it has so much power it can do useful things, but the queen is also, anytime it's attacked, it basically has to run away, and you can lose a lot of time by making careless queen moves. The queen should only come out early if you have immediate tactics, or if the queen can reach a stable square that is very hard for the opponent to attack. Let's talk a little more about the center. If I bring my knight here, it can go to 2 forward squares and it has 2 potential retreats. If I bring my knight here, we see 8 total squares it can go to, 4 of them moving forward. It's obvious this controls a lot more of the board than going to h3 does. Knights are slow pieces. They're only going to move 1, 2, 1. They're going to move in an L. So if your knight needs to get to the action over here, it's going to take you a lot of moves. You're going to need 1, 2, and to get specifically to that square, 3, 4, 5. Your knight's going to be very slow range to get there. What if your bishop needs to get there? 1, 2, 3, right? Unless the center is blocked, your bishop can get squares much faster. Which is why, if our knight was here, it's going to be harder to get to the squares we need. The closer we can bring it to the action early, the more likely it is to be able to get where we need it when we need it. Bishops are faster. Bishops are better at getting to their key squares. Of course, they are each limited entirely by color. The light squared bishop can never come to a dark square, but the bishop can get places quickly, which is why we get the phrase knights before bishops. Now, bishop c4 is a playable move, but usually white's going to develop the knight first. The knights need more turns spent on them to get into the action. Plus, it's not clear where the bishop belongs yet. Occasionally, passive development on e2 happens. d3 blocks in this pawn, and if we can't move this pawn, it can be hard to get the other bishop out. c4 makes sense, and b5 might make sense. b5 could attack a knight, could pin the knight, could apply pressure. The knight, however, it's not going to go here. It's most likely not going to go here. The knight e2 is a better square. It's probably going to f3. We know where it goes. And after black plays knight c6, maybe then we decide between bishop c4 or bishop b5, which are the two main moves. If we played bishop b5 immediately, though, black is under no obligation to play knight c6. Here, bishop b5 makes sense. Our knight attacked the pawn, their knight defended the pawn, we both developed a piece doing something useful, and now we attack their defender and put more pressure on the pawn. However, without knight f3 in there, bishop b5, we're not pressuring this pawn. Black could play knight f6 and immediately attack ours. Black could play c6 and drive our bishop away and take over the center. Black has lots of options. One of the reasons for knights before bishops is that the knight's squares that it would like to go to are much clearer than where the bishop would like to go to. So first, we start with the knight. This is usually the case. It doesn't have to be. Not all openings start with the knight. But a sense of why knights before bishops is useful to have. Now, what does knights before bishops mean? Does it mean we should play knight c3 here? Well, I quite like knight c3 here. I think it's a decent move. But knights before bishops usually means knight, then bishop, then maybe sometime later the knight, and then later the other bishop. Usually knights before bishops means knight, bishop, rather than knight, knight, bishop, bishop. Why? Why, if it's so important to get knights towards the center of the action, do we want to bring out a knight, then a bishop, before we bring out our other knight? Well, one reason is king safety. We want to castle early. This knight is not going to help us castle early if we're going kingside. Getting this bishop out lets us castle, and then we can proceed with other operations. Now, there are certainly openings where both knights come out first. For instance, in the Queen's Gambit Declined, white can play exchange and then play bishop g5. White can play bishop g5 now, but usually white just plays knight f3. This is the most common move. They develop both knights. Notice, with knight c3, they're not really preparing castling. They're probably not going to castle behind these advanced pawns. They're still going to go kingside. So when we play knight c3, we still want to develop these two pieces, and we still develop the knight first of those two pieces so we can castle kingside. And white will often follow. Sometimes they'll bring out this bishop first. White will often follow with g3 and bishop g2 to castle, or with e3 and bishop d3 to castle. So hopefully you can see knights before bishops should not be taken anywhere like an absolute rule. We should think, do we know where our bishop belongs yet? If we don't, maybe take the time to get our knights towards the center. A knight on the center in the center can be a wonderful piece. Let's delete all the nonsense lines I put in. So we don't want to bring our rooks out early. We should be skeptical about bringing our queen out early. We know our pieces control more squares when they're in the center. We saw when the knight moved towards the center how much more it controlled. And imagine if it moved here, it would control a lot of squares deep in enemy territory. It can't do that from far away. The bishop, if it goes here to g2, can already control these squares in enemy territory. The bishop doesn't need to be deeply advanced to control useful squares. The knight does. So we should treat the pieces differently and order their development differently. And we want to castle. Now, I think an interesting thing to do is look at 1e4. This lets our bishop come out. This lets our queen come out. We might not want our queen immediately, but it's useful to give it squares. We control the center immediately. It's a very good starting move, and it is the most common starting move at basically every level, but especially lower levels. And we can look. What would white do if white had another move? We could bring out a knight, and we probably want to bring out a knight before our bishops. But the best move would be to fully take over the center with d4. we'd have wonderful control of the center, our other bishop would be ready to come out, we'd have a huge space advantage. Therefore, black's most popular moves are actually the moves you would predict, black's best moves, if you were just trying to stop white playing d4. They're the moves that control d4, e5 and c5. And these are the moves that score the best for black. There are other moves that are very good moves. You definitely don't have to play these two moves. But the reason, or one of the reasons they make so much sense, is they control this d4 square. They prevent white getting their ideal pawn center. Now you might think white could play it anyway. Black takes. Now white doesn't have their ideal pawn center, and we brought out the queen early. Black will win time against the queen will have to retreat, and we could think, black already is going to have a second minor piece out somewhere, right? Black's going to have had 2 developmental turns for minor pieces. White doesn't yet have any. White's going to have lost a bunch of time. Of course, some people do play this line, and there are some tricks to it. But you can see why e5 prevents white getting their pawn center. Because even when they do play d4, we can trade and we win a lot of time. c5 accomplishes a similar goal. Knight c6 does not, because you're not going to play knight takes d4 without losing the knight for the pawn. So, those are the 2 main moves. The 2 moves that control d4. Now, if black's not going to control d4, what should they be looking to do? Because if they don't control d4, and they don't counterattack on e4, which we will get to in a moment, white's going to play d4. And black should be looking to strike back in the center as fast as they could. So the second tier of moves, the next 2 most popular moves, are e6 and c6. They have the same idea, though they work a little differently. Their idea is to counter in the center. White may have their 2 center pawns, but black's going to get 1 strong one. And with c6, we see the same thing. So with all these moves, black is looking to contest in the center, maybe not on the first move, but by the second move. Then there's kind of third tier lines. And again, these are fine to play at basically any level, though you won't see them nearly as often as the above 4 at the very top levels or in correspondence or computer chess. We have the Alekhine defense. I like the Alekhine defense. It immediately counters the pawn, attacks the pawn. If white plays knight c3, black could play e5 and get a good position. Black can also play d5 and again counter the center that way. So white usually advances and says, I don't want to spend time defending it, I'm going to counterattack your knight, and then I'm going to get my really strong center. And black's thesis is that white is overextended, that they can undermine these pawns. So black is not intending to leave the center alone. They played knight f6 and immediately attacked the center, and now they're going to play d6 and immediately attack it again. In none of these openings is black ever conceding the center. In a lot of my kids' students' games, I just see people make moves like this. And this isn't the worst move. You can play b5 and gain some space, but they'll just follow it with something like this. And then they just won't develop their pieces. And they will concede the center. They have no intention of ever attacking it. And I try to explain how important it is. And you can see in the moves that are most played, it's pretty coherent why they're the most played, what they achieve. Another move is d6, the perk, with the idea again of the next turn we're going to start attacking that center. Now the perk's a bit more hyper-modern in the sense that it doesn't look to counter immediately. It's going to develop the bishop, it's going to castle first, knights before bishops, and only then is it going to look to make inroads in the center. But it does intend to play them, and quite soon. The last line I haven't mentioned is the Scandinavian, Team Scandi. I see a lot of weaker players play e5, but the most pressuring move is, of course, to draw out the queen and win tempo against it. Now, the reason this opening isn't bad entirely is because now that white... Oops, what happened? Is that now that white has taken on d5, their ideal center looks something like d4 and c4. That's the only way they'll get 2 really good center pawns that can work together. Knight c3 wins time and is the best move, but prevents the c-pawn's advance. So this pawn will be somewhat alone. And if white could play c4 first, now white should not play c4 here, because black might check, and then play c5, and prevent d4. They'll have time to prevent d4. And the check can be annoying to meet. For instance, queen e4 check, if bishop e2, g2 hangs. If queen e2, black can trade queens and then still play c5 and prevent our intent. If knight e2, this knight is really getting in the way of development. And black can play probably c5, maybe e5 is good. but white's not going to achieve their center. So white plays knight c3, winning time against the queen while developing a piece, which makes sense. c4 would win time, but not develop a piece. And black moves their queen, usually to a stable square. So if you're going to keep the queen out, it should be on a square white doesn't have an easy time attacking. For instance, this square would be ridiculously bad. White can play knight f3 or d4, and either way, they attack the queen, and black will lose more time. People like queen e5 check a lot. The problem with queen e5 check is while it's a check, you're still going to lose time soon after. So the main moves are queen a5. b4 would take some time to prepare and isn't too feasible. White does often go for d4 and bishop d2 to pressure the queen that way. Queen d6. Knight b5 can hit the queen, but then it might come home, and the knight's going to lose time. It's going to get chased soon after, so black will go even on tempo. Knight e4 is similar. It's not a very useful tempo for white to win. More common are setups where white plays g3, d4, and bishop f4, trying to win time against the queen that way. But again, you'll see the theme. The queen comes out early, and the question is, does the queen lose a lot of time, or does it find a stable square? Everyone loves John Bartholomew's videos because they're excellent videos. He's very good at talking about chess. And he plays queen d8 here, completely backing up with the queen, saying, I'm not going to get chased around. I like that your c-pawn is blocked. I'm okay with you being up in development because I've gotten rid of your strong central pawn, and I can set up this very stable structure with e6 and c6. I'm going to try to get this bishop out first before playing e6. Whenever we move one of our central pawns one up, it can block in our bishop, and so we should look to get the bishop out first. But he is very comfortable defending these positions. He'll usually bring out a knight first because, knights before bishops. But then he'll try to bring out this bishop because he wants to play e6, and he doesn't want to block in the bishop. So that brings us to sort of moving 2 squares ahead with a pawn is nice, because our bishop can come out, and when we move this pawn, this bishop can come out too. So if we look at the French defense, where black quickly counters in the center, this bishop is blocked. This bishop often won't find a good home. This bishop is a good piece. After knight c3, it often comes to b4 and attacks something and is a useful pin. And by hitting the defender on c3, it pressures e4. This bishop has high hopes. This bishop on c8 does not. So you'll see in a lot of lines, say white plays e5, black sometimes makes a move like b6. And the idea is, my bishop is stuck, and so I'm going to trade it for your bishop. This bishop is good, so it gets to roam free. When we play a move like c6, the Caro-Kann, to play d5, say white plays e5, now, our knight's natural squares are both blocked. The drawback of c6 is it blocks in the knight. The upside, unlike having played e6, is our bishop is free to come out. Bishop f5 is the main move here, then e6, and then we have to figure out what to do with the knight. The Caro-Kann, this knight's the problem piece. If we play the French, suddenly this bishop is the problem piece. So I often give as a question for students, in this position, what would you play as black? This is not the most difficult question, but your pawn is attacked. What are all the ways to defend it, and can you evaluate them? I should say I'm giving this to young children, but I think any beginner to the game it is a very useful question for. And we can start listing moves and saying, do we like them or not? For instance, pawn here. Now, we've defended the pawn with a pawn. It is defended. Have we blocked in any of our pieces? Have we stopped our development? Yes, our knight has trouble coming to its ideal square. What have we done for king? So we have defended the center. We do support the center. Any move that defends our pawn will do so. But are we developing a piece? We did not develop a piece, and we are hindering developing one. And what did we do for king safety? Ooh, this is an airy space around our king. This feels very dangerous, and in fact, white has pretty big initiative here with a piece sacrifice on e5. But this move we should be skeptical of anyway. It opens up our king, it doesn't develop a piece, and it hinders our pieces developing. So often next, d6 is said, and this is a much better move. This is a perfectly playable move. What's the drawback? Well, it's a little passive because this bishop is blocked in. And again, when we move the pawns just one, we should know that might hurt our bishops. But it defends the center, it helps bring out one of our pieces, maybe to one of these squares, and it does not make our king more vulnerable. That's another way. Well, bishop here. We did defend the pawn, but our bishop gets in the way of this pawn moving. And if this pawn doesn't move, the bishop is hard to get out. So this one makes less sense, though may look more intuitive because we have developed a piece and defended our pawn. But the bishop here very much acts like a pawn. All it is doing is defending as a pawn could, and it blocks in our other bishop, so it is a bit weaker. Then people start noticing queen moves. Queen e7. What's the drawback? Well, our bishop's stuck. And we developed the queen, sort of, but we didn't develop a minor piece. So this doesn't really develop. It blocks in further development. It's not very good. Queen f6 I think is a little better. The bishop can still come out, but it blocks our knight in, and again, the queen out early is not really what you want most of the time. If you are bringing out the queen out early, you should have a very specific idea in mind. There isn't really one here. It's not the worst move, but it's not very good. The most common move is knight c6. It develops a piece, doesn't do anything about our king, and it supports the pawn and controls a central square. So knight c6 and d6 are the two main moves here. But I see lots of people play bishop d6. I see so many f6s among young students. We want to think, how do we help our pieces come out? How do we keep our king safe? I guess I'm going to show one more position, which is what about queen's pawn. Queen's pawn also helps the bishop get out. Our queen might come out. The pawn is defended by our queen. Unlike king's pawn, our pawn's not going to be immediately counterattacked against. Now the question again, what would white do with a free move? Well, of course, white would play e4. White can still get that ideal pawn center. So if you look at this position and just think, white wants to play e4, it should be pretty easy to come up with 3 of black's 4 main moves here. And if you look a sec, you should be able to easily find them. You just want to stop e4. So one way is d5. Again, we can control it with a pawn. A significantly less popular way, because it opens up our king, is f5, also controlling with a pawn. Now, d4 is defended by the queen, but e4 is not defended by anything. The king doesn't defend it. So knight f6 works this time. Knight c6 did not work against e4, but knight f6 works against d4, because e4 we can just take. While in the other line, e4, knight c6, d4, we cannot just take. It should be said, e6 is also played here. e6 is actually played here a little more than f5 is. The point is, if e4 we transpose to a French, we again quickly counteract their center. And if c4, black can choose between d5 and f5, either way, controlling e4, or knight f6, actually, also controlling e4. Is probably the best move and a main move. d5 is also very good. So without even knowing anything about these openings, just knowing we should control the center and develop our pieces, we can at least make sense of the first few moves of like main chess theory. We can see why is e4 so much more popular than f4. They both control a central square. Now e4 controls this one, f4 controls this one, but e4 helps us get our pieces out. And f4 opens up our king. I've played f4 in tournaments. I think f4 is somewhat less ridiculous than it looks, but it makes so much sense why e4 is a more popular move, and why the two most common moves in chess are e4 and d4. And if you look at e4, it makes sense why the most common replies are e5 and c5, why the next most common are e6 and c6, and why moves like knight f6, d6, and d5 are relegated down a little further. g6 is also possible. Knights before bishops make sense. A knight needs longer to get somewhere. You have to get it closer to the action quickly. And once you develop one knight, it makes sense why you might continue with a bishop before the other knight. If it comes out from the same side, it's going to help you get castled faster. And we might have more information about where the bishop belongs. The knights often belong here and here. That's certainly not always. The bishops, it's a bit harder to figure out where they belong, and getting more information of seeing how black develops can be useful. So I hope this was useful to someone starting out, just thinking a little about your opening moves and king safety, controlling the center, bringing out your knights and bishops, probably in the order of knight, bishop, though of course other orders can be fine. And I didn't really get into it, but preventing your opponent from doing the same, which I hope I'll cover in a later set of examples. All right.